If he wanted to, he would. Now, that is a pretty famous saying, at least in a lot of the social media circles that I've been in. And it's applied to a lot of things. If he wanted to call, he would. If he wanted to text, he would. If he wanted to take you on a date, he would. If he wanted to, commit to you, he would. If he wanted to marry you, he would. It's about effort. It's about consistency. It's about, intention and intention being followed by action. And I want to tie it to the Clifton Powell interview that happened recently and also to a previous interview from Mike Epps. Now, Clifton Powell and Mike Epps, both husbands, both in marriages for many, many, many years. And in both of their interviews, they said, I'm just getting to this point where I'm going to treat a woman right. And Mike Epps was in his 50s. Clifton Powell, when he said this, was 69. In fact, in the interview, a man asked him when had he become monogamous, and he said, today. And he, at that time, had been married, I think, 10 plus years, maybe 20 years. But he's becoming monogamous today. So he hasn't even proven that he can be monogamous, that he, as he put it, has truly learned how to love. He hasn't even proven that. It's just lip service at this point. So I want to bring up a personal experience. When I was married the first time, I was in therapy. I was trying to get my husband to go to therapy because we had a tumultuous relationship. And I didn't want my kids growing up in that situation. I didn't want to be in that situation. But I was more concerned about them because I was raising sons. And I didn't want them to have toxic relationships when they grew up. I didn't want them to think that the arguing in the marriage that I had was normal. The attitudes that they would see around the house, I didn't want them to think that was normal. So I was trying to get my husband to go to therapy. And he said to me, I'm a great husband. I know I can't keep a job for more than 6 months. And I call you out of your name and I break things around the house when I get angry. But I'm a great husband. And when I heard him say that sentence so clearly with his whole chest, not a shred of doubt, no shame, no embarrassment, just stating what he felt was a fact. This is what he felt was fact. He was a great husband. I realized that his standards and my standards were worlds apart. I had held down the home whenever he would get fired because he would lose his temper and lash out. I was paying all the bills at the time. I was also taking care of the kids and put them in daycare because he was not really a reliable caretaker, with the kids. He wouldn't feed them the way he should. He wouldn't change their diapers the way that he should. So I really was like, I wouldn't even call myself a great wife because I'm always striving for more. I'm always thinking, I could cook better meals. I could keep the house cleaner. I could, do more activities with the kids. I could do more. I could do more. I could do more. And his standards were literally, like they say, the bar is in hell. He was literally calling the bar in hell great. And so if he wanted to, he would. So he didn't feel like he needed to change anything to be a great husband. But he criticized me about whatever, about not being loving enough, not being encouraging enough when he was unemployed. Where was my encouragement? Where was my, pat on the back when I'm holding down the whole family and everything? You know what I'm saying? So I began to realize that his standards for me were through the roof. His standards for himself were in hell. And that was the day that I just basically stopped biting my tongue and told him everything about himself that I felt that he had lacked in and he had, disappointed me about, and how he did not need to have this huge, high opinion of himself when he was failing in all these areas. And the very next day I told him it was time for him to move out. I was done. I'm done. I'm done trying to be your wife in this situation when your standards are on the ground in hell, and my standards, I'm constantly reaching for higher, better performance from myself. I'm constantly pushing myself to try to be better. This is done. I'm done with this. And so I bring that up to say that I'm not trying to speak for Clifton Powell or for Mike Epps, but their interviews reminded me of that statement, how they were very, very comfortable with the fact that they had spent all this time up into their 50s or up until 69 treating women however they felt like treating women, and that was fine and dandy. And then their goal was to one day, when I grow up, to be all the way right, to be a good man, to learn how to love. But, every other thing that they probably wanted to do, whether it was learn a part for, a role that they wanted to play, learn how to drive, learn how to Mac, learn how to play a video game, whatever else they wanted to learn, they wanted to do that. And since they wanted to do it, they did it. If he wanted to, he would. But they didn't want to be good men to the women that they were with. Not enough. It was just a wish. It was just a prayer. It was just a nice thing that might happen someday. And, there's been so much rhetoric from patriarchy that, if you're the right woman, he'll jump through hoops and he'll change for you. If you inspire him, if you build with him, if you believe in him, if you breathe life into him, if you leave room for him to pour into, like T.D. Jakes said, all of this stuff put on women. And in fact, in the Clifton Powell interview, he talked about how he needed a woman to have a bigger vision of him than he had of himself. And he needed her to come in and fix him and show him where he was wrong and encourage him. But, the problem with that, I remember trying to have that bigger vision for my husband, trying to get him to go to therapy. And what he told me is, why can't you just be content? Why can't you just do what I tell you? Why, you're submissive, but you're not submissive enough because you're asking me to do something I don't feel like doing, I don't want to do, I don't have to do, because even though I can't keep a job or control my temper or stop breaking stuff when I get mad, I'm a great husband. And you just don't recognize my greatness because you expect too much, you want too much, you demand too much, you're too hard to please because you're just supposed to be content that you have a man and you're married. And that's kind of what it boils down to for some men, that if you get chosen to be a wife, to be a girlfriend, to be taken off the market, you're just supposed to put up with whatever he decides is good enough. You're just supposed to tolerate it and grin and bear because you're not single, and being single is the worst thing that could happen to a woman. Oh my gosh. And that rhetoric has kind of fallen by the wayside because there was a lot of women saying, no, you know what? I've looked at the relationships out there. I've looked at the married women. I've looked at how they're treated. And I don't want that. I don't see that as an upgrade over singleness. I don't see any benefit to that. And I don't want that. And they also look at men and they say, you know what? If he wanted to, he would. And because he's not, he doesn't want to. And I'm not going to put up with men who really don't want to be married, to be husbands, to be fathers, to be partners. They want to be served. They want to be catered to. They want to be allowed to run amok. But they don't really want accountability. They don't really want growth. They don't really want change. They don't really want to demand better and more of themselves. In fact, their attitude is, why do I have to change? Why can't I just be the frat boy that I've always been and find a woman that'll put up with it because she's just happy to have somebody by her side? And so if he wanted to, he would. And a lot of women now are saying, and even a lot of men are saying to other men, stop with these excuses. You're grown and you need to act like you're grown and you need to do better and be better. May you walk in Zenergy. If he wanted to, he would.